This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then notes on resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. Hello, welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky, and today my guest is Shu Simon, a speaker, coach, and consultant. And we talked about the fact that resiliency is context dependent. We talked about building capacity and even talking about science as a global good. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Shu, I am so excited to be talking to you today. How are you doing?
I am doing great, Manya, and it is wonderful to talk to you.
Hey, okay, before we get into all the juicy content and who are you and all that good stuff, I want to ask you, if you could have any superpower, what would that be?
I spent a lot of my youth thinking about this question. And for the last couple of decades, what I would have converged on is photosynthesis.
Whoa.
So photosynthesis is not an imaginary superpower. It is a real superpower. Green plants have this superpower.
Mm-hmm.
And what it does is it creates energy for an organism to use using just the sun. And I always thought it would be really cool if all of my base needs were met just by going out into the sun.
Oh, I love it. And I suppose if you spent a long time in the sun, you would get enough energy to do other things.
Unfortunately for plants, they don't quite generate enough energy to move around of their own volition. So that's where the imaginary part comes in.
Okay. Wow. Now you wouldn't have to be green, right?
No, this is all fictional. So yeah, I could still look like anybody else. I could still look like myself. I just, not have to stop and eat.
Oh, I kind of like that. I would love to not have to stop and eat on some of these days. Oh, that's a great one. That you are the first person who has said photosynthesis is a superpower. I love it. Okay, thank you for sharing that. And now let's dig into, who are you and what do you do and how is it that you're in a place to be thinking about resilience?
Well, I'll start by saying that I am a scientist, which you may or may not have guessed by my superpower. And I have been a scientist for a couple of decades. And I went all the way up through the PhD phase, and I was going into academia. And I ended up just taking an opportunity to go into government, which led to a career in business. And one of the things that I learned when I switched from academia to other realms is science is a global good. Like science does really good for humanity, but there is a big silo between what science is or what scientists do and how it gets transferred into humanity for the benefit. So I do two things right now. Right now, I am a chief technology officer of a startup company. It's called Inozo Technologies. And so I'm working with both the science and the business aspects on a day-to-day basis. I am also a speaker and coach, working to help companies really foster their scientific talent and to help scientists bring their best science out into the world.
Oh, that's fascinating. You are sort of a bridge between the two worlds.
You're right. Yes, you are not the first person to call me a bridge speaker, and I appreciate that.
And thinking about your roles and, in both science and business, how is it that you're thinking about resiliency?
When I think about resiliency, I think about the cliche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think there are a few caveats to that, but I do think of resiliency as the ability to survive setbacks or things that do not kill you, but are not particularly what you would have liked or what you enjoy mm-hmm. to various degrees of negativity. So in order to pursue a career in science, I believe it takes a lot of resiliency. And the reason that I think this is I survived all the way through graduate school. I have a lot of friends who survived either partway or all the way to the PhD phase. Mm-hmm. And it was not an easy trip. There were a lot of setbacks. Mm-hmm. And in order to complete it, and even to participate in it, there's got to be some system to survive all of these setbacks and come out on the other side one way or another.
Yes. And when you're talking about your experience in graduate school, I would imagine that's a very stressful position to be in, especially when you're thinking about going for your PhD.
It is. It is a very stressful situation. And we can talk about some of the reasons why it is stressful, or we can just rest on the idea that this is a very, very long project. Mm-hmm. It is several years long. And there's no guarantee when you enter that you will come out with having created new knowledge. So it is a risky endeavor. Yeah. The personalities are very interesting because mm-hmm. there's a lot of competition among researchers, competition for resources, sometimes competition for intellectual property, and just this idea that you may or may not be able to get something out at the end.
That's a fascinating piece that I had never thought of, that you may go through all of this work and stress and dealing with all of these people and ideas and still not necessarily come out with something that you were hoping to come out with.
Yes, there's no protocol. If you make all the right decisions, if you follow the right path, that doesn't mean that at the end, you are going to get a successful result.
Okay. Well, I guess that is kind of baked into the definition of resilience itself, right? It's that ability to bounce back, but there's no promise that you'll bounce back to the same place you were before or the same person you were before, I guess.
That's a growth process that mm-hmm. if there's no particular outcome, there's just this accumulated body of knowledge. Once you have achieved sufficient new knowledge to have published and to have written a thesis and to move on, then that's what the end is. But very few people know at the beginning what the outcome is going to be at the end.
Ah, yes. That's very interesting. And as a trauma survivor, that perfectly aligns with the idea of resilience, which is no idea at the beginning what the end is going to look like, but I know that this is a journey I need and want to take myself on. So I have had the honor of being live in person for your TED Talk, where you talked about resonant frequency. And can you just share with our listeners a little bit, what is that and why does it matter for us as humans?
Oh, yes. It was a delight to see you in the audience. And I really enjoyed giving that TEDx talk for TEDx Brandeis. And what resonant frequency is it's a physics concept. And no surprises here. The whole way I think about the world is in terms of scientific concepts. And so I see them all over the place. One of the things that I see about scientific concepts is they can be layered. So if I'm thinking about how electrons move, I'm thinking about that in a similar way to, maybe how people move, like something that is bigger, something that I can actually see versus just conceptualize, because that's the only way I can think about it. So resonant frequency is a very well-known physics concept, and it's a property of certain machines, like, for example, springs or pendula. So a pendulum, an example of a pendulum would be a swing, so something that swings back and forth. And what these machines do is they have internal components that work best when they get some sort of input. So, for example, you're pushing the swing at the right times. So what that means is you can't get more out of them if you put more in. You can't push more on the swing and get that swing to go higher, because the only time it can really accept your energy is when it's in the right place and at the right time. Mm-hmm. So I learned this in high school because it is a very basic concept. And I noticed when I was in this high school class, like my mind was getting blown. I was like, wow, more in doesn't necessarily mean more out. And then all of my high school colleagues were like, I don't know, doodling on their notebooks. Like it wasn't really sticking with them. But the reason that it stuck with me is I was noticing the same thing in my high school career. I was working really hard, and I wasn't getting more out of my high school career. I wasn't getting better grades just because I was studying later into the night or doing more. I really, really wanted to do well. And people would tell me, oh, if you want to do well, work hard. Okay, do I want to do better? Let me work harder. And here's this physics concept that says that's not necessarily the correct model.
Wow.
What is more important than working harder is working in the way that the system will benefit.
Okay.
So it takes sensitivity to what the system needs, and you give it what it needs at the right time.
Okay. And you are a scientist and you look at the world through that lens. I am someone who looks through the world through the lens of thinking about trauma and resiliency. So I'm curious your thoughts about the relationship between resonant frequency and resiliency.
Okay. When I'm thinking of resiliency, it's some way that I am absorbing a trauma, either big T trauma or little t trauma. And I'm absorbing it, and it is making some sort of effect on me. And in the best case scenario, it's making a growth effect on me. Mm-hmm. But that's not necessarily the case. What if it is, in fact, too much for me to handle? In that case, it does not go well. What if it is? So there's this difference between, I think, one very big overarching trauma event and a lot of little microtraumas. And I would say graduate school was a lot of little microtraumas. Every day you come in and you find that somebody's moved your equipment or something is not going the way that you want. And there are a lot of little things to overcome, and it gets frustrating. But if it's at a pace where you can handle and you can learn and you can grow, then that's a resonant frequency. Mm-hmm. Now, that said, if there's a much, much bigger trauma, and I will admit that I had a much, much bigger trauma in graduate school that did derail me for quite a while. I had a stalker, and I went to court to fight the stalker. Wow. This was a big change in my life. That is not the level of disruption that I could handle periodically. Mm-hmm. I could handle that once, and then I needed a community, and I needed a support network, and I needed some time to deal with that, to heal from it, and then keep moving on from there.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's an intense story, and I can imagine how difficult that was. And I appreciate your thoughts about that relationship between resiliency and resonant frequency. And what do you think is the role of the external environment, whether that's our community or the organizations we're involved in facilitating resilience?
The external environment can really interact with a person to either support growth or keep adding microtraumas or keep adding problems. It can be one or the other. And if a community expects and knows how to deal with the effects of trauma, then the community can absorb some of this effect. The community can provide support. The community can provide a safe space for healing. If, on the other hand, a community is more, I would say, aggressive or competitive and is taking advantage of you already being knocked down and then just piles on more to try to really, to get ahead at your expense, then that's very much going to reduce healing. That's going to just add to the suffering, and that's going to make resiliency more difficult.
Right. What do you think people misunderstand about the concept of resilience?
Oh, I disagree with the idea that I hear from a lot of people that resilience is a personal characteristic.
Mm-hmm.
You either have resilience or you don't, or you can test resilience by throwing obstacles at people, and that this is even necessarily a good idea. I think that resilience is context dependent. It is growth dependent. How much you can take and absorb and grow from really depends on who you are and what else you're dealing with and where you are in society. Who else is helping you with this? So I don't think it's individual at all. I think it is a big interaction of a lot of different variables.
That's interesting, thinking of it as specifically as an interaction. I have always thought about it, or not always, recently thought about it as both a personal trait that we all have to some degree, but also as something, that's necessary for the community and for our organizations and institutions to support. But I never thought about it as that maybe what I'm thinking of is the interaction between the two. Well, what do you think our organizations can or should be doing to maybe take it away from thinking about resiliency as a personal trait or lack of resiliency as a personal failing?
When organizations have an expectation that something is to go wrong, and when organizations build in some margin so that things can go wrong without completely destroying the project or the person, and then use some of that margin to protect whoever is healing or whoever needs protection. And maybe I would, from my own thinking, maybe reduce that frequency that they are asking of that person while that person is healing. I think that can go a long way towards long-term growth. That can go a long way towards keeping individuals in work systems where they could work long-term, except maybe they're dealing with something at this very moment. So simply the expectation that people are never functioning at their best 100% of the time. Like they can have their best moment, understand that that's a moment, and there are going to be ebbs and flows.
I like that. We're not all working at 100%, 100% of the time. Some of us are not even close.
But even then, even if you're not working 100%, you're probably working at 100% of your capacity in the whole context of your life. So if we think of work as an 8-hour day and you're going to this place and this place expects your time and they expect your intelligence, you don't necessarily just shut that off. And if it takes a lot of energy to give that, where else is it going in the rest of your life? So if you can't quite give 8 hours of 100% time, can you give 6 for a moment? And then sometimes you're giving 10. Like it just depends on what you have available at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also, of course, family and sleep, just health concerns. There are other responsibilities aside from work responsibilities.
Right. We talk about work a lot when we talk about resiliency and support for resiliency, but of course it is only one piece of our lives. And I like thinking of, I'm not going to get this right, but I like thinking of this as all some sort of big energy flow and with our resonant frequency and how we're responding. And I guess I like the idea that it's context dependent. Resiliency is context dependent. I kind of like thinking about that. What do you say to people who think about things like, what is my resonant frequency and how resilient am I, as kind of a touchy-feely, soft skill, has nothing to do with the world of work or the world of science. How do you address people who think it's not something important to pay attention to?
If somebody doesn't think that something that's important to me is important, that's okay. Like I'm not out here trying to convince everyone. If it in fact has some value, then it certainly the idea has value to me. Mm-hmm. And it has value to some others based on some feedback. This is just an offering. You can take it or leave it. Mm-hmm. If you don't agree, I'm not going to try to convince you. I'm going to assume that you have some other system that works for you, some other way of thinking about it.
Yes.
And even overwork, even burnout, like there is some clout in thinking of yourself as somebody who is a hard worker.
Oh, interesting.
So I can value that in other people. You want to be somebody who works hard. Okay, go ahead, work hard. Just keep doing that until it doesn't work for you anymore. And I myself was somebody who did that until it didn't work for me anymore.
Right.
Like you've got to get to that point where your model doesn't work in order to change. Otherwise, why would you put in the effort to change?
Right. And that's true with so many things, right? We sort of do it ourselves until we need to call for help, or we put in the effort until we realize this isn't working and I need to do something differently. But I guess I'm not so much thinking about like the personal responsibility, but I'm more thinking about, do the organizations that we work for, the institutions that we're part of, do you think they have any responsibility to supporting our resiliency and supporting us to be living our best lives?
Oh, there's the idea of responsibility. Mm-hmm. And there's also the idea of, is it in everybody's best interests? Mm-hmm. So employee turnover is expensive for organizations. And if every time anybody had an off day, we just fired them, that would be extremely expensive.
Yes.
So if there's an organization that's set up that I need 110% of all of my employees active engagement at all times, or else I will fail, you're going to fail. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's just a good idea to have some systems in place to pick up slack where there is slack, because there is going to be slack. Mm-hmm. That's just the way of the world.
Yeah.
I can give you an example from a different worldview of mine. So I ride motorcycles, and every so often I go on a track day. And what that is it's a very safe and closed system where people take their motorcycles and then they learn better motorcycling skills.
Okay.
And so they can turn faster, they can go faster. This is someplace where you're not going to interact with traffic. You are specifically trying to push your skills. So what happens when you try to push your skills? Sometimes you fail. Mm-hmm. So in order to go on a motorcycle track day, you've got an ambulance that's waiting right there just in case anything happens. And most of the time, nothing happens. In fact, my favorite thing to do is to watch the people in the ambulance reading novels, because there is really nothing for them to do. Except there is this expectation that if something goes wrong, it is going to be so important that we have got this system in place to come fix it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. That's a great example of, I guess, kind of, letting people take personal responsibility for what's happening, but having that safety net if it's necessary.
Yes.
Also, it sounds like a lot of fun. Now, I've only ridden a motorcycle one time in my life, and that was enough to teach me that although it looks like fun, and I'm sure it is fun, it wasn't quite the right thing for me.
Maybe it's not going at your resonant frequency, and that's okay.
I think that's the way to say it. Motorcycles are not my resonant frequency. I like the freedom and a little bit the speed, but for me, the danger side of it was just loomed too large for me to want to kind of get through it. Anyway, we could go down a path and talk about motorcycle riding for quite a long time. But I guess I should bring us back to a more general topic of resiliency and resonant frequency. And, how can we individually know when it's time to say no to something, or how do we recognize that maybe we're not working at our resonant frequency?
How do we know? One thing that we can do that I think helps us figure it out is meditate. And what I mean there is there's an internal system. There's what you're consciously thinking of, and there are all of the unconscious processes that are getting you to go forward and survive. And they're not always in alignment with each other. And I think it's very easy to just be kind of on edge, but not necessarily know why.
Mm-hmm.
And what meditation does is it can help bring those systems in alignment, or at least put them into communication with each other. So when do you say no? Well, when the answer is no, when it's beyond your capacity. And who knows when it's beyond your capacity? Well, you know it. Are you irritated by the request? Are you behaving well? Are things going in a way that is productive? If not, then probably the answer is no. My worry is sometimes the answer is no, and we say yes anyway, because there is so much social and professional pressure to have capacity.
Yes. And I think there's a lot of focus on powering through. And like you said, giving 110%, even if that's not what you have available. Like, I think there's also people find value in being that person, the person who says yes to everything or who works through everything, even when they don't have the capacity, which I think is a recipe for maybe not disaster, but disappointment.
Yes. What I think happens when the answer is no, but what gets communicated is yes, is things get done poorly, and then everybody's disappointed.
Yes. I'm just thinking of some personal examples, which I'm sure many of our listeners can also be thinking of times when they have said yes, when in the moment or shortly thereafter, they wish they had said no.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, I wish I could say yes to this. It sounds like so much fun. I just don't have capacity.
Yeah.
And I myself, because I think this is so important, I myself have been known to hear yes from someone else and then push back and say, really? I noticed that tone of voice from that yes. It sounded like a yes that you would prefer to be a no. And usually people are so relieved to hear that they do have permission to say no, that they'll say, yes, actually, thank you. Thank you for giving me that permission.
Yes. Well, that's very insightful of you as a colleague and manager and person to be able to recognize that and give people that permission. We talked about that in another podcast episode, sort of giving people permission to just be human and not be superheroes.
One of the things that has helped me about that is I'm a mom of 2 boys, and they are very young. And no does not fall easily on their ears.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a couple of things going on. One is it's my job to defend my no, even if it's difficult to defend it, because they're going to need to learn how to live within other people's limits. Mm-hmm. And no matter how much I would like to give them everything that they want, all of their heart's desires in the moment, it is, first of all, not possible. And second, not even productive for raising large humans from tiny humans.
Interesting. So you have practice.
Yes.
You have practice understanding where people are coming from when they're asking you for something.
Yes. And I've noticed this in other people as well, that if somebody's asking me a question, I have the expectation that no is an acceptable answer. And if I say no and I get pushback, that's when I start to feel like, hey, wait a minute, I gave you the answer. Why are you still arguing?
Yes. Yes. Also good to remember, if you're asking a question, no is an acceptable answer. You may not like it, but it is an answer. So, Shu, as we have been talking about resilience and resonant frequency and stress and how to say no, all these great topics. But what do you think is an important lesson about resilience that you've learned because of your work or something else in your life?
Oh, one important lesson that I have learned is just because I have capacity or interest in something does not mean anybody else has capacity or interest.
Mm.
And so I have found a way to fit what my expertise is in with what other people's expertise is, so that it's not that we're matching,
Mm.
it's that we are really building on each other. So I no longer find it a problem if I'm expecting something from someone that they're not able to give.
Mm-hmm.
So I've changed my mindset into, this is something that is easy for me. I can do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have more permission to ask somebody else for what is easy for them, but hard for me. And then there's that resonance going back and forth between what we are good at.
Oh, I like that thought. Sort of, we each focus on the things that we're good at, and together we will get the results. And, we've talked a little bit about communities and organizations. And what do you think is the most important thing, let's say an organization like a workplace, can take to be supportive of the resiliency of the people who work for them?
I think that it's really important to have a capacity or to have a method for building capacity as opposed to just expecting and using capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And here, what I mean is, if an organization has a bunch of people within it, and each one is performing, and their job is to perform, and they don't necessarily perform well, what do you do about it?
Mm-hmm.
Do you cut them off? Do you shame them? Or do you simply take that as useful information and find some way to either work around that, like not use them for whatever it is that they can't perform well, or if it's really necessary, somehow augment that capacity?
Wow.
So this is a way of finding out when the answer is no. No, I can't do that to your satisfaction. Maybe I thought I did, but it wasn't meeting expectations. Having an understanding, okay, with what you have right now, you cannot do what this thing that you were going to do.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do about it?
I love that. Thinking of maybe that response, no, that's not something I can do right now, as information, not as some sort of value judgment or making a value judgment about why is that person saying this, but just kind of taking it as information and then, okay, you can't do this. How do we get it done? I find that fascinating. And I don't know that I'm repeating it back to you properly, but I'm loving this thought.
I think you've gotten it. And I will say that I maybe cheated in coming up with this answer because, once again, I've got 2 young children who are limited by their developmental capacity.
Mm-hmm.
I still like them a lot. And it's really fun for me to see, can you do this? Oh, no, you can't. But I have created a system, a family, where they are not responsible for doing all of their laundry.
Mm-hmm.
I am responsible for figuring out what they can do to contribute and then iteratively helping them build their capacity.
Right. And I love that that's, part of where this idea comes from. The other thing is, we expect that once we're adults, we somehow expect that adults can just do it all. And I think we forget that we do each have limitations based on a whole host of things. And once we get to be adults, people aren't paying as close attention as you are to your children's limitations. Interesting. All right. So, Shu, what's one question that you wish I had asked you, but I did not?
Oh, wow. I don't think you would have necessarily come up with this as a question. So I am just going to say something about time in graduate school. Now, I had mentioned that I had a big traumatic event in graduate school that involved court and all sorts of problems. I am not unique in that. And one of the reasons is graduate school takes people in their early 20s. And these are formative times for people when their brains are still developing and they're still gaining their independence and figuring out who they are. And usually within the several year time span of getting a PhD, if that's what you're going for, something is going to go drastically wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say 80% of my colleagues had a big experience somewhat similar to mine.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not even necessarily part of, oh, my story, or I had something extra special to deal with. No, this is real. This is typical. This is the time in people's lives when something goes wrong. And hopefully there's a community there to help support them through that.
Wow. That's a really great reminder that that's just life. It's not unusual for people to be dealing with these kinds of situations. The specifics may be different, but the general idea. Thank you for sharing that. And just speaking about you in graduate school, what would you tell your 18-year-old self, so a little bit before you got into graduate school, about resiliency?
Oh, well, there's what I wish my 18-year-old self could fathom. And then there's a different one where I would actually just feed this information to my 18-year-old self and she'd probably get it. So what I wish my 18-year-old self would fathom was, just because somebody gives you a hoop does not mean you have to jump through it.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody else's standards do not necessarily have to be my standards. And I get to say no to somebody's request for me to prove my brilliance or awesomeness or whatever. I can just disengage.
Yes.
And that was a really hard lesson.
Yes. It's a hard lesson for me too. So I'd like to take that and also tell my 18-year-old self. So thank you very much for that.
My 18-year-old self would have had to live that. So that would have fallen on deaf ears. So what my 18-year-old self might have gotten is, this is another motorcycle analogy. If somebody is treating you in a way that you don't like, and you're going to tell them no early so that they have a chance to perceive. So there's a perception time. They first have to get that message, and then react, actually figure out what they need to do differently, and then finally put on the brakes. Yeah. So they need a chance to do all of that before they actually stop that behavior, especially if it is a habit. Mm-hmm. And if I thought I was doing them a favor by not telling them no until I couldn't tell them no without yelling, then it really would have been better to say it early, often, and kindly.
Yes. Shu, thank you for sharing your story and talking with me about resiliency and resonant frequency. How can our listeners reach you if they want to learn more about you and your work?
Oh, well, they can take a look at my website. They can even download my PhD thesis from the website if they want.
Oh, nice.
And it is www.shufits.com. Shufits is spelled Xufits.
Excellent. And we will put a link in the show notes for that.
Excellent. And they can also find me on LinkedIn at Shufits.
Well, Shu, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having this conversation with you. And thanks to our listeners for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. So if you'd like to learn more about me, Manya Chilinsky, I work with organizations to help understand how to create environments where people can thrive after difficult life experiences. And I do this through talks and consulting. I'm a survivor of mass violence, and I use my experience to help leaders learn about resiliency, compassion, and trauma-sensitive leadership, to build strategies to enable teams to thrive and be engaged amidst difficulty and turmoil. If this is something you want to learn more about, visit my website, www.manyachilinsky.com, or email me at manya@manyachilinsky, or stop by my social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much.